I imagine there are a lot of you out there who either sew or would like to start sewing. And half the battle of sewing really is picking your fabric. So I thought it would be a really great idea to take us on a journey through the most common types of fabric and analyze a bit about their weave, a bit about their fiber content, a bit about their structure, their body, their drapeability, and how easy they are to work with. So hopefully by the end of this video, you will be able to understand not only what all the different types of fabrics are, but also how they behave, what they're good for, and by placing yourself on the scale of sewing knowledge, you will hopefully be able to better understand which fabrics might be a good choice for you to work with, and which ones might end up fighting you a little bit more than is probably good for you. Look, if you're a complete beginner and you want to try a challenge, at least you'll know it's a challenge going into it. I'm going roughly based on fiber type, so starting with cottons, into silks, into wools, into nets, but there will be a number of items that could be made of a variety of different fiber types. We're gonna start off with the first fabric on our list, plain weave cotton. This is gonna be your typical cotton print, your quilting cotton, cotton muslin or calico, any cotton fabric that is a one-to-one weave. So a one-to-one weave is talking about one weft thread, which are the horizontal threads, goes over and under one warp thread at a time. So just like a basket, over one, under one, over one, under one. And that's how you end up with a beautiful one-to-one, very simple, very plain weave. And this can be done with any type of fiber pretty much. But with a cotton is a very sort of sticky fiber, which means it's gonna be very stable. There's gonna be nothing to sort of throw you a curveball. You have your pretty typical no stretch on the warp, no stretch on the weft, and a little bit of give on the bias. That's just because these threads, when they are weaving like that, if you pull them sideways, they do kind of shift. So you will get a little bit of stretch on the bias, but you can work with that. It's a pretty standard medium weight, so it's gonna be opaque, it's gonna be super well behaved, super easy to work with. So plain weave cotton is gonna go very solidly in, very friendly for beginners. So the next fabric that we have is a cotton twill, and within this category you might find cotton canvas, cotton duck, cotton drill. These are very hard-wearing, sturdy, durable fabrics that are going to hold up really well. So twill refers to this sort of weave. So again, you can get twill in any sort of fiber type, but we're talking about specifically cotton twills. But the nature of a twill is that instead of going over one, under one, it goes over around 3 to 4 strands of the warp, instead of over one or over two. And that's how you end up with these diagonal stripes. It's not really a decorative thing, it's just the pattern that emerges when you go over 3 of the warp threads and then shift slightly and go over 3 over here and then shift a bit more. You end up with these stripes. So twill weaves are going to be very hard wearing. It's going to stay where you put it. There's no moving around, no sort of wiggling and bending out of shape. It's going to be very well behaved. The only potential tricky bit with working with a twill is that unlike a one-to-one weave, you can't very easily see the warp and the weft. You can't see those straight lines that run up and down along the selvage, so therefore you're not going to be able to track the grain line as easy. Grain line is going to be very important when you're sewing because if your grain goes a little bit off, your fabric can swing slightly off and you can get weird wrinkles and things might not behave as well as you want them. So understanding where your grain is and what grain you're on, if you want to be on the straight grain or if you want to be on the bias. But just knowing where you want to be and being there on purpose is going to be very important. And a twill weave makes it a little bit more difficult to do that. For that reason, for that little bit of extra mental awareness, I'm going to put a twill weave in a moderate intermediate. So the next fabric on our list, we're still in the cotton realm. This is gonna be your very lightweight one-to-one plain weave cottons. So we're talking voile, we're talking batiste, we're talking cambric, we're talking lawn. This is your very wispy, very white, transparent sort of cotton. These are very beautiful. They're still relatively easy to work with because you can very easily see the grain line. It is very possible to cut things perfectly on grain because you can just cut along or draw a thread and then cut along that gap. So if you are a beginner and you want to make something a little bit more transparent, that's going to be your best bet. For that reason, I think I'll put this in beginner. This isn't typically the case with sheer fabrics. Sheer fabrics tend to be a nightmare, but I think the lawns are definitely going to be the easiest sheer fabric that you will come across. Oh, we got a heater on. So the next fabric that we have is cotton sateen. This is a cotton, but it's made using a satin weave. Although many fabrics are called satins, satin is called satin because of the weave. So once again, instead of your warp thread going over one, under one, or over 3 under one, a satin weave travels over at least 4 warp threads. When this is a silk thread that's very lustrous and very shiny, you end up with this very shiny material because that thread is traveling in a very uninterrupted path across those warp threads. And you just get plain uninterrupted shine from those silk filaments. With a cotton, we don't necessarily have as much shine as we do with a silk satin, but we still do have those long float threads. So with a cotton sateen, you're gonna get a lustrous finish to the surface of the material. The thing with a satin weave though is that it is a lot weaker. Because you are traveling over more threads, it makes the surface of the fabric more prone to snagging and snapping and damaging. Again, this is more of a problem with silks than cottons, which tend to be sturdier. Cotton sateens are very often used in bed sheets, in pillowcases. It's very useful for all sorts of garments that you want to have a more luxurious, lustrous finish, but still have the benefit of working with a cotton, which is going to be very easy to work with. This is definitely going to be a very good bet. Cotton sateen is going to be very well behaved. It's not going to like move around and warp around. Where you put it, it's going to stay. Again, the thing with satin weaves is that you're not going to be able to see the grain line very easy. So you are going to have to measure very carefully for this. So once again, going to be very well behaved and easy to work with, but you might require a little bit of extra knowledge in terms of the construction, the measuring out, the laying out, and the cutting out. So for that reason, I'm going to put this in a low intermediate. Next, we have denims. This is perhaps falsely a different category because it is essentially kind of the same thing as your other cotton twills. It is just a twill woven cotton. Denim just specifically has been dyed traditionally with indigo, although nowadays tends to be chemical dyes. It's a very sturdy, hard wearing fabric. It's again one of those fabrics that isn't going to have too much warp and too much wiggliness. It is going to stay where you put it. It's going to be very easy to sew, and it's not going to fray too much. You'll probably get a little bit of fraying in the beginning, but as with most cottons, especially the cotton twills and one-to-one weaves, tend to just fray to a point and then just stop fraying. So you can very easily just pink the edges, and like in theory, that will kind of just be fine. So for this reason, I'm gonna put denims right next to the cotton twills in that, again, gonna be a very well-behaved fabric, but just having that extra knowledge of grain line and how to find your grain line is gonna be very important when working with denim. So the next fabric we have on our list is going to be still a cotton, but this is with the caveat that this cotton is infused with a little bit of stretch. And you will find these all over the place, especially nowadays. It's becoming more and more popular to have like 5% elastane woven into your cotton. So if you're shopping for a cotton and you want a plain weave cotton, always be sure to test it for a little bit of stretch, because sometimes, and in fact, most of the times when you're fabric shopping these days, they will be infused with a bit of stretch. And if you don't want that, that's going to be very important to make sure that that's not there. Adding a bit of stretch into your cotton can be great if you want to be more malleable with fit, if you want your garment to be more expandable slightly, but especially if you're working with historical projects, you want to avoid that stretch wherever possible. The other thing about stretch is that it is going to make your job a little bit harder. When you're sewing your fabric, you can't pull it too taut, otherwise you're going to end up with wild wrinkling and warping in your fabric. So again, it's going to require a bit of knowledge of how to work with stretches. Not as much knowledge as, say, some of the more deliberately stretchy materials that we'll get to later, but having that little bit of, okay, we have to account for this, we have to prepare for this, I'm going to put this in intermediate. Our next cotton is cotton coutil. This is going to be a very densely woven cotton, like the densest you can possibly weave a cotton. And as a result, you're going to end up with this very thick, very stiff, very unstretchable material. It will stretch, again, a little bit on the bias, but on your straight grains and on your cross grains, you're gonna get no stretch in this. This is gonna be really great if you're making foundation wear, shapewear. This is very popular in corsets. It's a great interlining material if you want to stiffen a fabric without using a fusible interfacing. This is gonna be very useful for that. It's not a huge frayer. It's not gonna move around on you. It's pretty much just gonna stay where you put it. The weaves of cotton coutils can be a little all over the place. There are some that are woven in beautiful patterns. This coutil that I have in particular is a herringbone weave. So I can use these stripes to gauge where my straight grain is and be sure that if I'm creating a foundation layer like a corset that has to be very rigid on one grain, but maybe have a little bit of stretch where it's going down across the waist, grain is going to be so important for that. If you have a coutil with a straight grain on it, then you're set. Beginners, going to be fine working with this. The only possible caveat I will put towards a coutil is that because it is so densely woven, You might have a bit of difficulty getting a needle through this. So if you have any hand sewing processes going into this, just be prepared that you're probably going to have to use a thimble and a very thin needle, the thinnest needle you can possibly get your thread through. So with those caveats, I think I'm also going to put this up in beginner. You'll have a fine time with this. Next up we have knit, also called jersey knit or just jersey. Typically, these are made from cotton, but they can also be made from silks, they can be made from wools. Effectively, we are referring to the quote-unquote weave, although it's not woven, it's knit. It's a completely different process. But the nature of knit is because it's done in interlocking loops, the entire piece of fabric is going to be very stretchy. This is, in more common terms, probably known as t-shirt fabric. A cotton t-shirt is going to be made out of this. It's going to be a knit, it's going to be very stretchy, it's going to be very soft. There's generally no stretch infused into this, although in many modern cotton knit garments there is like 5% elastane, again, just to make it super stretchy. And as soon as you put these in the dryer, the elastic starts disintegrating and, planned obsolescence, etc., etc. 100% cotton knit, that's where it's at. So the great thing about knits is that they are going to be very forgiving in terms of cut. They don't fray. In fact, if you have cut up a t-shirt before, you probably know they just kind of roll up on themselves and then they just stay there. The big caveat though is that because it is a stretch, you will not be able to just sew this like a normal seam with a non-stretched thread. You will have to use a zigzag stitch, so a stitch that kind of zigzags and will be able to flex a little bit. So entirely different sewing process required for this, and for that reason, I think we have our first hard mode. Ooh. We're gonna move on to additional plant fibers. First up on that list has to be a plain weave, again, 1-to-1 linen. Linen is slightly different from cotton in that it is a bit springier. It has a lot more body and bounce to it. It also wrinkles as soon as you breathe on it. So there's that. You will be pressing it for the rest of your life. Plain weave linen is fantastic for grain. If you're working with a garment that is just squares and rectangles, like if you're doing a historical project and you're making shirts or shifts, you're gonna have a fantastic time with this. It's gonna be very easy to see that grain line and to cut exactly on grain. That being said, you will have to cut this exactly on grain because the minute that linen starts to go slightly off grain, you will start to get all sorts of wild things going on in your drape. Because it's got such body to it, it will start to have a mind of its own. If that's part of your design, fabulous, work with it. But if you're trying to make a straight grain garment, definitely be aware of that. If, however, you need to start cutting curves or angles with your linen, things start to get a lot more difficult because linen does tend to shift. The minute you try and rub a pencil on it, all the fibers just move over here. And then it just goes, it just wants to just be all over the place. So if you're not cutting this on grain and following one grain line, you might have a bit more difficult time working with linen. And for that reason, we're gonna put it in intermediate. But again, with the caveat that if you are working with straight on grain, clear cut linen, beginners will have no problem. Next, we have a linen twill, which is again a linen that's woven in a twill weave, so passing over 2, 3, 4 threads at a time. So twill linens tend to be a bit sturdier, a bit heftier, a bit more durable, but you also lose the grain line. And they also, once again, according to the quality of the linen fiber, have a lot more bounce and a lot more body to them. And for that reason, linen twill is also going to go in intermediate because not only do we have the challenge of working with linen, but we also now don't have the benefit of that grain line. So you have to be very careful to measure off of your selvage to be sure that you're getting on grain, but also be careful that your linen hasn't slightly shifted out of place because it will tend to do that. Now we have hessian cloth, otherwise known as burlap in North America. This is often made of jute fibers. It's very rough, sort of the outer vegetable husk of the jute fiber. So this is a very stiff, kind of industrial fabric. This is potato sack. It's very loosely woven, so it's going to fray like the minute you breathe on it, and it will just continue to fray until you do something about the raw edges. You cannot leave this unbound if you have any hope of wanting your garment to last, or your potato sack for that matter. The grain is very easy to see because it is very thick, very rough spun, and very loosely woven. But you will require a lot of fabric treatment and hem finishing, like pretty much as soon as you cut out your garment. And for that reason, this is also going to go in intermediate. So we have a taffeta, which is a one-to-one woven silk. It could also be made from polyester, but originally made from silk, and therefore when it's synthetic, it is being made to emulate the properties of silk. So the taffeta yarns are very finely spun. You get really, really, really tiny little threads and very densely packed. So we don't have a whole lot of shine to this. I mean, we do have a bit of luster, but we don't have the shine of satin because those threads are very busy going up and down, over and under those warp threads. So that light reflection is getting very frequently interrupted. But that means that taffeta is very well behaved. It stays where you put it. It doesn't move all over the place and want to do a little dance and escape from you. It will be easy enough to follow the grain, although it will be quite fine. Taffeta, like any silk, is going to be fairly prone to fraying just because of it is the nature of the more slippery silks. However, because of the denseness of the weave, you can on occasion get away with just pinking the edges and it will be fine. So because of the relative ease of working with this, I'm going to put this up in beginner. Beginners, you have fun working with your taffetas. If you want a silk, work with your taffetas. So the next silk we have is a silk duchesse satin. Sometimes you can get polyester duchesse satins. They're not going to be as good. So you can tell there is silk involved, if not 100% silk, if it starts curling up on itself. These silk duchesse satins, they will want to do nothing but just go have a little nap in their little burritos. And honestly, I respect that. Duchesse satins are very thick. They're very sturdy, so they're great for, again, foundation materials like corsets, or very structural gowns. There's lots of wedding gowns made out of duchesse satins. Again, going back to satin weave, this is a silk woven as a satin. So these silk filaments, especially when they're 100% silk, they've got high luster, they're very shiny, and when you're passing over 3, 4, 5 more of those warp threads, then you end up with a really lovely, shiny material like this. However, again, that does mean that the surface of a duchesse satin is going to be slightly more delicate than, say, the surface of a taffeta, which is a one-to-one weave. So definitely going to require, as a garment, a bit more careful handling. But in terms of satins, this is going to be the easiest to work with. It's very stable. However, there is no easy grain line on this. The minute you start to go off grain, you start to get more stretch, which can introduce some strange behavior and some wrinkling, especially if you're trying to make a tight-fitting garment. So again, going to be a fairly friendly enough fabric to work with, although again will require some knowledge of weave and pattern cutting and grain line. So we're going to put this again in intermediate. And you'll just curl up again. That's fine, we'll just know it's you. So the next fabric that we have is a crepe back satin. Once again, this can also be made from polyesters, viscoses, rayons, various synthetics that are manufactured to mimic the properties of a silk satin. So again, this is woven with a satin weave, which means we're going to have a slightly more delicate surface. We're also going to have no visible grain line. Satins especially tend to be very prone to fraying just because of the amount of floats in the weave. They're not as securely anchored into that weave. You will probably have to fully finish your seams. A crepe back satin is going to be a lot floppier, a lot drapier than a duchesse satin, which is very tightly, firmly woven. But what defines a crepe back is that it's got this very matte, often crepey backing to it. It's not a double-faced satin. Because of the drapey nature of these, they are going to be a little bit less well-behaved. They will kind of want to do some dancing and just want to kind of wiggle away from your pencil. So these will be a lot harder to mark out. They will be a lot harder to control, a lot harder to identify the grain. For this reason, this is going to go in hard mode. This is going to represent the general category of quote-unquote lining fabrics. These very lightweight, sort of tissuey fabrics traditionally were made of silk, so China silk, habutai, crepe de chine, but nowadays they tend to be made out of polyesters, viscose, again, synthetic fabrics mimicking the properties of these lightweight tissue silks. They could also not be linings, like anything can be possible. I think of all the fiber types, silks tend to be the most difficult to work with just because they are a bit more slippery. And the lighter the weight of the silk tends to be the more difficult to work with. These tend to be one-to-one woven, so, pretty standard weave. We can tell the grain line very easily, which is going to be good because these are very difficult to work with. They're very floaty, they're very lightweight. Again, they're going to try and wooge all over the place and run away from your pencil. So being able to see that grain line is going to be pretty important. And because we can see that grain line, this one's only going to go in hard mode. So next we have silk charmeuse, which is again a satin weave. So you will have this beautiful, shiny, almost liquidy type fabric. And it's made of very fine yarns. So again, it's got no structural integrity to it. You know, it's just gonna kind of drape very beautifully. Because again, we are working with a satin weave here, we have no indication of where the grain is. The drapiness does mean that paying attention to your grain will be important here. Where is that grain? Who knows? You can measure and you can mark, but the fabric will immediately want to just dance right out of the way. It does not stay where you put it. You breathe on it wrong and all of a sudden it's 5 inches away from where you wanted it to be. It also frays like nobody's business. This fabric, expert mode. Work with that at your peril. It has no right to be that beautiful and that stupid to work with. So next we have chiffons, which again, traditionally made of silk, but nowadays can be made of viscose, of rayon, of all your sorts of polyesters. So a chiffon is made from, again, very finely woven yarns. So it's going to be very light, very delicate. It's going to drape very well, and it is woven very loosely. So you're gonna end up with a lot of transference from behind. It's gonna be very transparent, very translucent. We do, thankfully, have a one-to-one weave on this, so we can find grain a little more easily, although the fibers really are just so thin that following a grain line is going to be basically impossible. Once again, this is going to be the sort of fabric that will just want to sort of move away from wherever you've put it. It's not going to behave well. It's going to fray like nobody's business. It's not going to be as much of a nightmare as charmeuse, but I'm still going to put chiffon down here in expert mode. Next, we have organza, which is traditionally made from silk, but nowadays tends to be made from polyesters, synthetics that can mimic the properties. So what differentiates an organza from, say, a chiffon is that the weave is very stiff. An organza has a lot of body, a lot of spring, and a lot of structural integrity. So it is slightly easier to work with than, say, a chiffon, which just has no bones. An organza at least will have some structure, although it will still have a tendency to shift, especially with the pressure of, say, a pencil or a ruler. You will have a little bit of give and a little bit of shifting in that weave. So definitely something that you'll have to pay attention to whilst you're cutting. And for that reason, this will only go in hard mode. Moiré or faille, which I'm kind of going to put in the same category, although they are slightly different fabrics. The main property of these is that they have this ribbing, this sort of grosgrain-like texture to them. A moiré will have a very distinct water-pressed pattern to it, so it will have this sort of wood-grainy, kind of watery treatment to the surface of it. But because it's got these ribs in it, thankfully this stabilizes the fabric a lot. This is going to be a lot easier to work with. It will have a little bit of give and want to wooge a little bit, but it's not going to be as unwieldy as a lot of other silks in this category. It is really going to fray, so you will have to be very conscious of controlling your edges, but I might actually give a moiré or a faille a beginner. I think this wouldn't be the worst for a beginner to work with. Dupion, dupionis is a type of fabric that has been around in Eastern cultures in Southeast Asia for quite a few hundred years. It is kind of similar to a taffeta in that it is a one-to-one plain woven silk. It is often slightly lighter weight, slightly more tissuey, slightly less crisp than a taffeta. However, the unevenness of the yarn and the huge slubs incorporated in the weave of this material was really not favored in Western historical dress. For the same reason that in historical linens and silks that were favored, we tend to have very even weaves. The practice of spinning in especially European textiles tends to really focus a lot of quality on evenness of the yarn and of the weave. So a dupioni that includes huge slubs of raw silk is not going to be seen as the most high quality silk from a Western perspective. I'm not a scholar of Eastern dress history, so I don't quite know the extent to which dupioni was viewed within the culture. However, I can tell you if you are doing Western European historical dress reconstruction, this is going to be a heavy avoid. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. It is beginner friendly. I just have a vendetta against it. So we have lamé, which is kind of in the same family as a chiffon. In fact, like structurally, it kind of is. Its just defining characteristics is that it is woven with a metallic weft. Historically, this could be done with actual metallic threads, but most of the lamés these days are just made with plastic tinsel. This is going to have a lot of the unfortunate properties of a chiffon in that it is going to be very movable, it's very temperamental, it's very hard to control. It drapes beautifully and has like the most beautiful shine you will ever see probably in a fabric. However, because we have this very clear cross grain, it's not the worst to work with. We don't always have a straight grain, which tends to be the more useful grain, although you're not going to be as wild in the dark as a lot of these expert modes. But I will still put this in kind of a low hard mode, like almost expert mode. So now we have a crepe. There are many silk crepes out there. There are also many wool crepes out there. You can make a crepe of all sorts of materials. The nature of a crepe is that it has this sort of crepey, really crimped yarn that makes up a very crepey surface in the weave. Crepes are going to fray quite substantially. They are quite loosely woven. They do have some really nice body to them because they've got this texture. However, the looseness of the weave doesn't mean that they're going to be a little bit more difficult to control. Again, we have all this texture going on the surface, so we're not always going to be able to confirm 100% what our grain line is. For that reason, I am going to put crepe in hard mode. Moving on to our velvets. First up, we have a chiffon velvet or a lightweight velvet. Once again, most velvets are not made of silk these days. They tend to be blended with rayon or nylon. These lighter weight velvets that have a lot more drape in them, they tend to be backed on a chiffon or a georgette or something very, very lightweight so that you get this very drapey material. Not only is velvet a nightmare to work with because when you cut it, there's just fuzz everywhere. You can't press this because as soon as you press it, the pile, the little fluffy bits of the velvet will just get crushed, and then you end up with crushed velvet, which is great if you're going for like 90s Ren Fair, but if you're not going for that, then you have to use a needle board, which is where you put the velvet face down on some needles in order to press every aspect of this garment. It's difficult to work with, and when you're working with these very chiffon-y velvets, you also have the nightmare of all the properties of chiffon, which means it's not going to stay where you put it. It's going to want to move at the slightest touch, so if you're trying to mark it out, good luck staying on grain. If you're putting two pieces of velvet pile side together, so you've got fluffy bit and fluffy bit, the minute you try and smoosh them down to sew them, they will shift. They will shift to flatten that pile, which means it will not be where you've pinned it, and you will, who knows where you've ended up on your seam line. And for that reason, soft velvet has to go in expert mode. On the other hand, we have stiff velvet. The stiff velvets tend almost always these days to be backed on a really heavy synthetic or rayon or polyester or something. Historically, this would have been a silk backing. Stiff velvets are a lot friendlier to work with. The lighter weight the velvet, the more difficult it is to work with. These velvets, they don't fray as much. They're a lot more easy to control. You will still have that issue of if you've got pile on pile trying to stitch things together, right sides together, you will have some shifting still going on there, but this is going to be a lot friendlier to work with. And therefore, I'm actually going to put stiff velvet in intermediate. Cotton velvet is the same process of creating a velvet as you would for a silk. So basically, the pile is woven onto the ground fabric, and then it's cut so that you're left with this little tiny fuzzy pile on the top that's woven into the fabric itself. However, instead of doing that out of silk or polyesters that are made to mimic silks, cotton velvet is all done with cotton. So this fluffy bit is all cotton. Is a lot more well-behaved, it's very sturdy, it stays where you put it. Again, you will have the challenges of working with velvet in that you can't put an iron directly on it, you'll have to use a needle board with this, as with the stiff velvet, and you will also have some pile shifting if you try and sew right side to right side. So this cotton velvet is going to go right up here next to the stiff velvet in intermediate. Next, we have a corduroy, which is kind of basically the same thing as a cotton velvet, although corduroy can be made of other things like wool, polyester, like everything these days. The great thing about corduroy, though, is that there's a very strong grain line. You can really tell when you're on grain with a corduroy because that corduroy got those grain stripes in it. So that makes things quite easy to work with, again, because it's got this either cotton or wool backing to it. It's very well behaved, it's very stable, but again, will require those velvet stitching techniques. So this is going right here, again, with intermediate. Should we move these here? Let's move these here. Okay, there we go. We've got a couple different qualities of net. This is stiff net, or tulle, if you will. It can be made of silk, it can be made of cotton, it can be made of nylon. This is the stiffer quality, so it's going to be very crunchy, have a lot of body to it. These nets don't really fray. They're very easy to cut, to control. The only thing about nets is that when you're working with a net, you tend to be working with masses of it, which is just like a logistical nightmare. Like if you're making a big tulle skirt, it's just like a lot to work with, but it's not all that difficult to work with as a material. Sure, a stiff net, you can go in beginner. Next we have a bobbinet, which tends to be made of cotton. All nets and tulles are distinct in that they are twisted together essentially through a kind of the same technique as bobbin lace making. And it's distinct in that it has a lot of stretch in one direction and not a whole lot of stretch in the other direction. Bobbinet is really great because you have this combination of stretch with the durability of the twist, but you also have some stability in the other direction. So bobbinet is often used for things like foundation garments that you want to have a lot of movement to them. In the 1950s, this becomes really prevalent to use for corselets, for the foundations of sculpted gowns. And the trick with working with bobbinet is that you double layer it. So one layer has no stretch this way and one layer has no stretch this way. And then you end up with this really cool, stable garment that still has a lot of give. It's a really cool fabric. It doesn't fray a lot, but you will need to be conscious of grain on this. And grain isn't super easy to spot on this. You're gonna have to sort of keep your eye out. So I'm gonna put bobbinet in intermediate. So then we have a soft net. This is a net that's got a lot less structural integrity than our stiff tulle. It's gonna be a lot drapier, a lot softer. Again, doesn't fray, but it's not gonna be as strong as a bobbinet will be. This will tear a lot more easy than a bobbinet, which can be used as a foundation garment. Wouldn't do the same for something like a soft net. This probably will require a little bit more handling than, say, a stiff tulle, which can kind of just be laid where it wants to be sewn and it will just sit there. This will have to be sort of maneuvered into place. However, it's not going to be that difficult to figure out. So we'll put this in intermediate. Brocades are fabrics where the pattern is woven into the fabric. Traditionally, they are made from silks. Nowadays, a lot of them tend to be made with tinsels and polyesters and rayons and all sorts of wild things. They're very dimensional. They've got a sort of structure to the surface of the fabric. They are often double-sided, although not always. But inherently, it's not a print. The pattern is woven into the fabric itself. Brocades are very tightly woven and very stable and tend to really just stay where you put them. The only question is on some brocades you won't be able to see the grain line. Although in many cases with brocade, because of the way that it's woven, there will be a weave pattern of, one motif goes up and down along the grain line. So you kind of can orientate yourself a little bit as to where you are on the fabric. Brocades really will fray though, especially when you've got really complex things with satin weaves, but as long as you're controlling the edges of your fabric. I don't hate putting this in beginner. As opposed to jacquards, which are very similar to brocades, but they tend to be a lot lighter weight. The jacquard is kind of like a champagne in that it has to be woven on a jacquard loom, which is a very complex piece of machinery. I think it's developed in the 18th century. And because the weave is so complex in them, they were operated with punch cards to tell the machine where to do the weaving when. And that is actually the inspiration behind modern computing. So you can thank the jacquard loom and jacquard weaves and jacquard fabric for the computer that you are probably watching this video on today. I love textile history, it's very important. Anyway, jacquard fabrics are a f***ing nightmare. It's a beautiful fabric, but you essentially have silk charmeuse level quality and behavior and warpability. Pretty much often no indication of where the grain is. You've got a very lightweight fabric that is not going to be very well behaved, and for that reason, jacquard has to go in expert mode. Just like coding, in fact, at least to me. So next we have tapestry, which is sort of similar to a brocade in that the pattern is woven into the fabric. Tapestry involves multiple layers of weaving, like weaving upon weaving upon weaving in order to get those patterns to come through. As a result, tapestries tend not to be double-sided, as some brocades are. But tapestries are going to be very thick. So these, you're probably not going to make a very drapey gown out of these. You often see tapestries hanging on the walls for that reason. You know, you could make bodices out of these, you could make jackets out of tapestry. It's a fairly easy fabric to work with. The grain's not that impossible to see. It's going to be a very thick fabric, so very hard wearing. Again, you're going to need a thimble to sew through it by hand probably. It's usually made from cotton or wool, so it's very well behaved. There's no warping, there's no like moving. I'm going to put this in beginner. Next we have a mattelassé, which kind of is in the brocade category. This is a weird sort of fabric that is woven to look like it's quilted, but it's not quilted. These can be made of all sorts of wild different things: polyesters, viscose, rayon, generally silk. They tend to be a bit springier than brocades. They tend to fray quite a bit, and we don't necessarily know where grain line is. I might just put this in intermediate just to be safe. So next we have tweed. This is generally a wool fabric, although nowadays it could be made of acetate or whatever sort of polyester blend. A tweed is generally made from woolen spun yarns. So I guess we need to go into the difference between different spinnings of wool. This will be important, I promise, and we'll explain why so many people hate wool unjustly. But wool is either spun as a woolen yarn, which means it is thicker, it is rougher spun. It's using the shorter staple, like the shorter fibers, which means it's thicker, it's fluffier, it's easier to felt, but it's also scratchier. As opposed to worsted wool yarns, which are spun a lot finer, made from the longer staple wool fibers, which makes them a lot softer. But we'll get to the worsted wools a bit later because tweeds tend to be made from woolen wool yarns. So they tend to be very fluffy, very thick, and therefore used a lot as outerwear. But they do tend to be plain woven, either 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. You can kind of get some really interesting weaves, such as tartans and checks, houndstooths, window panes in tweeds. Tweed refers to the woolen weave wool, not the tartan or the whatever sort of pattern is going on. You can have plain tweeds. This is a tweed. This is a tweed. Anyway, tweeds are great to work with. They don't really fray a whole lot, again, because of these woolen yarns. The fibers tend to felt together, especially over time, which is why we're really not supposed to wash these, because as soon as you wash them, you really start to felt the fibers and it shrinks. It's a nightmare. Wool is very stable. It's very easy to work with. It's very clingy, so when you put one thing on top of another and pin it together, it stays where you put it, which is fantastic. I'm gonna put tweed in beginner. Where's their room? Right there, right there. So in contrast to tweeds, which are made of woolen yarns, we have wool gabardine, which is a lighter weight wool. It's a lot drapier. This is what you usually see, like suits, sport coats, trousers are usually made of this. It's made from a worsted wool yarn, which means, once again, the yarns are very finely spun, and this is a very soft wool. This is not gonna have the issue of being scratchy against your skin. It's gonna be very soft, very comfortable to wear. Because the fibers of the wool are a lot more controlled, we don't have as much felting going on, which does make these easier to wash. However, it also does not control the fray as well. So you will have to be conscious of fraying going on here. You will still have a little bit of woodging, and especially when you're marking out or pinning or cutting, things can try and shift out of place ever so slightly. So the wool gabardines, I'm gonna put this in intermediate. Wool felts are a really interesting case because they are non-woven, which means we don't have any sort of 1-to-1 weave. It's not a knit, there are no loops looping the fabric together. It is purely relying on the wool fibers being matted together so closely and so compactly that it creates a piece of material. You might probably be familiar with like craft felt, which is not wool felt. I mean, very similar concept, but if you're thinking, oh, why would you make a garment out of felt? It's gonna look like a craft project. You're thinking of like the synthetic, like acetate felts that are sold for like 50p in a craft shop. Wool felts, which are used for garments, are made from woolen fibers, which means that it is going to be a very nice, beautiful, finished piece of cloth that is not woven. So that means we don't have any issues of grain here. We're not gonna have to worry about bias. We're not gonna have to worry about straight grain. There's gonna be no fraying. So for that reason, wool felt goes in beginner. Next we have a flannel. This can be made from either wool or a cotton, or nowadays like all sorts of synthetics. But a flannel is different from a felt in that it is a woven fabric, so you do have that usually 1-to-1 weave, but the cloth has then been brushed. So you end up loosening a lot of those fibers and creating this really soft nap to the surface of the material. If you look very closely, you can see under all the fuzzy stuff, you will see a very slight weave going on in there. Typically flannels, especially these days, are woven with tartan patterns, check patterns, plaid. This is printed. So that's actually going to tell you nothing about your grain. But if you do have a flannel that is woven as a tartan or a check, then you will have really great grain indication there, which is going to be really great for cutting out. Flannel is going to be very stable. It's very sticky. So when you put one on top of the other to sew it together, it's going to stay there. It's not going to move. Flannel is going to go in beginner. So if you're looking for your first sewing project and want to make a nice pair of pajama pants, I think that's what a lot of people start with. You're good with flannel. Next we have fleece. Traditionally it's wool fleece, but a lot of fleeces today tend to be synthetic. A lot of the time fleeces are made on knitted backings, which are going to make them very easy to cut out, very easy to work with, very not prone to fraying. If you don't intend to have the garment be a stretch garment, like a fitted shirt or anything, then it's going to be a very easy thing to work with. It's not going to fray, it's going to be very easy to control, and it's going to stay where you put it. I would put fleece in beginner. So again, for your nice set of beginner's pajamas, you're good with your fleeces, you're good with your flannels, you're good with your felts. Enjoy being comfy. We have a bit of our wild card category now. These are materials that I didn't really know where else to put. For example, fur. False furs, faux furs, which are made of petroleum-based fibers, so plastics, polyesters. This stuff is an absolute nightmare. Like, my condolences to all the furries out there. Like, it's 100% plastic. It's so sweaty. The fluffy bits are gonna get absolutely everywhere. Because this is a petroleum fiber, it's a plastic fiber. You're inhaling this. It's terrible for your lungs. Please wear your respiratory protection if you're ever working with this stuff. They tend to be mounted on either a knitted or some sort of stiffened backing. They require a bit of technique to cut them. If you cut them with a pair of scissors, you're gonna cut the fluffy bits as well. It tends to be the general consensus that working with razor blades and just barely cutting through the ground fabric and not cutting all the way through to the fur is the way to go with this. There's a technique to this, and making it look natural. Cleanup is a nightmare. This has gotta be hard mode. Like, you've gotta really wanna do this to subject yourself to this. Tailor's canvas is a very important material if you want to get into tailoring any sorts of jackets, waistcoats, structured materials, because this is the secret that makes everything look right. This is like the non-fusible interfacing that the professionals use. They call it horsehair canvas or tailor's canvas because traditionally it was woven with a weft, that is left to right horizontally, of horsehair, which is a very springy material. You know, it's what violin bows are made out of. If you're a horse girl, you probably are like, yeah, obviously I know. It's very springy. And with a warp of linen or cotton or whatever. Nowadays, they tend to use a synthetic horsehair, some sort of plastic imitation horsehair. But the great thing about tailor's canvas is that because of the horsehair weft or imitation weft, it gives the horizontal aspect of the fabric this incredible body, this great springiness. So when you fold it sort of horizontally, the garment's not going to collapse. It's going to hold this really incredibly rounded shape. Whereas if you're going vertically, because of these linen warp threads, they're not quite as stiff, so therefore the fabric just kind of collapses. So if you're bending over, it's not restricting your bending over, but it's still holding out a really nice, beautiful round shape across the body. This stuff is magical. You do have to be quite conscious of grain on this. However, because this is not seen, you don't have to be super careful with it. But it's fairly easy to work with. The surface of it is very grippy, so it will kind of stick to whatever you want to put it on. I will put tailor's canvas in intermediate. Mostly because if you're working with this, you probably are getting into some tailoring and you will have to really understand how to shape and to sculpt the fabric around the tailor's canvas. It's so worth learning how to do. But for an absolute beginner, you probably want to learn some more basic sewing techniques before you get to the tailor's canvas. We have tarlatan next, which is very familiar to all of us in historical reconstruction because this stuff is also magical. This is a plain woven cotton, so again, one-to-one, it's very loosely woven. It's essentially a gauze, it's a cotton gauze, but it's been stiffened with a glue. Traditionally, it's water soluble, so this is not to go in washable garments. But I also know people who have done tests washing their tarlatans and they've come out fine, so do with that what you will. Tarlatan is an incredible stiffening agent, but it's extremely lightweight. So it doesn't add any weight to the garment, but you get that springiness, that body. Historically, this was used absolutely everywhere, especially in the 19th century, as interlinings for skirts to make things stiffer, to give things body, to prevent things wrinkling. It's very easy to cut out because it's glue. It's a stiffened material. There's no fraying to worry about. You don't have to worry about grain because, again, it's a glue. There's no stretch. There's no warp. It's very easy to work with. So tarlatan, we're putting this in beginners. If you ever need to stiffen a garment, cut out some tarlatan. Okay, next we have spandex or lycra. This is typically a knitted fabric, but made from a specialty synthetic fabric that is specifically meant to produce this spandexy material. I know very little about this material because I don't think I've ever used this. This is what you're going to use like leggings, shapewear, swimsuits, leotards, dancewear. There's absolutely going to be no fraying going on here. To work with this though, you will really have to have significant knowledge of working with stretch materials because presumably if you're using a spandex or a lycra, this is a garment that's going to have to take a lot of motion. It's going to have to really stretch, which means we're doing zigzag stitches, we're using stretch threads, we're using, I don't know, ballpoint needles, all that sort of very like specific technique stuff. And for that reason, this is going in hard mode. Terry cloth, did you know this had a name? This is basically towel material. This is the typically cotton loop type fabric that we know and love as towels today, or bathrobes. I've never actually had reason to work with it, but you never know what's out there. This is a cotton. It's fairly well behaved. It's fairly stable. It's gonna be fairly comfy. The main thing about terry cloth, though, is because the surface is so completely concealed by all these loops, both on the front and on the back, it's very difficult to tell when you're on grain. I genuinely don't know how people work with this. I've never done it before. But it hasn't got that sort of movement that makes working with it difficult. Like, it is very stable. I might put this in intermediate. Like, you're gonna have to work a little to find your grain lines, but once you got yourself cut out, I think you're gonna have a fairly simple enough time working with it. Anyway, this is our assessment here. We're gonna put some labels on these so that if you wanna screenshot this and take some notes and maybe reference this while you're going out fabric shopping or trying to find some materials that you think will be most appropriate for your skill level, or if you're up for a bit of a challenge. If you're interested in learning more about fabric, and specifically, if you're interested in learning what your fabric is made of, there's a really great way to tell all of that, and that is by lighting it on fire. Safely, of course, do it safely. We have a whole other video where we went through all the different fiber types and what to look at, the color of ash, the smell, the burn quality, the speed of burning, all the different criteria you will need to identify what the fiber type of your fabric is made out of. So go forth, watch that next if you haven't done so already. If you're ready to take your next step into actually sewing some garments and want some inspiration, we've got a whole playlist of all sorts of garments that we've made right here on this channel. And of course, subscribe for more sewing, fabric, textile education videos, as well as sewing inspiration. And with that, I shall see you anon.